Hello! Welcome to today's session, Introduction to Research Methods in Psychology. As always, before this session begins, please make sure that you've printed the PowerPoint lecture notes and that you have them in front of you so that you can take notes as we move along. We're going to begin today's conversation on Intro to Research Methods by understanding this, the scope of psychology. In a prior lecture, I've alluded to this, but I think it bears repeating. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior, thoughts, and feelings. So a couple of points to note about that and a couple of points to emphasize. Any given field, whether it's biology or chemistry or physics, it has a scope over which it operates. It looks to understand answers to questions in a certain sphere. Here, our sphere is going to be this: behavior, thoughts, and feelings. This is the scope of our field. This is how the field derives its topical coherence. There might be important questions that are of interest to you that are purely chemical, and those are great questions. They're probably beyond the sphere of psychology. There might be important questions to you that are purely biologic. Great questions again, probably beyond the sphere of psychology. That said, I'd also like to point out something that you might remember from Intro to Psychology, and that is psychology very definitely borrows from other fields. Much of what we know about psychology comes in part from our understanding of the underlying biological processes and the underlying chemical processes, and to some extent the underlying physics. It is also true that we borrow very heavily from a branch of mathematics called statistics. So clearly we are eclectic, but we also have some limits as to what we investigate on a regular basis, and we try to provide new information about these things: behavior, thoughts, and feelings. And this gives us some topical coherence. We might also point out an equally important point, and that is that we have some methodological coherence, and for us, our methodology is entirely grounded in the scientific method. In upcoming sessions, we'll spend an entire lecture or more on the scientific method. In today's session, we'll get some feel for what that's like, and we'll see how these two are relating to each other: the topical coherence, behavior, thoughts, and feelings, and our methodological coherence, the scientific method. As you might recall from Intro to Psychology, it's true that psychology has some ancient roots all the way back in the philosophers of ancient Greece, including Aristotle and others of his time. More recently, though, we temporarily think of modern psychology as starting in 1879 at the University of Leipzig in the experimental psychology laboratory of Wilhelm Wundt, who's shown here. And here is where we most readily identify with contemporary psychology. This was an early start for us in 1879. Shortly thereafter, some other folks began to chime in, and here are some big names from the field of early modern psychology. One that you might remember from Intro to Psychology is Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a physiologist. He was a medical doctor by training, as is true for many of these early founders that we have on this page. Many of them were initially trained as physicians. And there's an important reason for that. Remember that in the 1870s, there were no PhDs in psychology. It wasn't a field unto itself. It might have been considered in the 1870s as maybe a subfield of biology. And most of the early founders were in fact trained in biology. And they looked at such things as the physiological basis of our sensations and our perceptions. And that was what Helmholtz is largely known for within our own field. Of course, Helmholtz was an important figure for other reasons in other fields, but this was the contribution that he made to psychology. Another name that you might remember from Introduction to Psychology is Ebbinghaus. He was very important in early studies on memory. And some of you might remember the serial position effect, in which we give the participant a series of items to be remembered, and then we ask the person to recall those items, and something very non-random happens. The person tends to remember the first elements on the list, and tends to remember the last elements on the list, and tends to forget the items in between. And so we have this primacy effect and this recency effect, and what we can say then is that Ebbinghaus was all the way back in the early days of psychology working on that problem already, and set the stage for much of the contemporary memory research that we have. All these folks, interestingly, on the left-hand side here, happen to be based in Germany. On the right-hand side, we have some folks who have come along in more recent years in the history of psychology, the history of modern psychology. Maybe the most well-known is William James, who put forth the book known as Principles of Psychology in 1890. This is one of the more famous books in the history of psychology, in 1890. Shortly thereafter, William James was a professor of psychology at Harvard University, and he inspired many, many subsequent researchers whose names may also be known to you. Another name that you might know from Harvard University, a very famous psychologist, B.F. Skinner, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, was associated with behaviorism, and that was the dominant way of at least American psychology, the dominant way in which American psychology was conducted in the 40s and 50s. And then at some point there was a debate between B.F. Skinner and a fellow named Noam Chomsky, who was at MIT, and the debate was about language and whether some of the Skinnerian behavioristic principles could explain how it is that humans acquire language. And it looked to be the case that many would say Noam Chomsky actually won that debate, and that tended to move the field toward what we might call the cognitive revolution over this linguistic issue. So this is just a brief glimpse at some of the scientists that have begun to form our field of psychology using some different kinds of methods, some of which are borrowing from biology. But in any case, they're using different kinds of research methods to answer questions about how we acquire behavior, how it is that we hear, how it is that we remember, and so forth. Important aspects of our science of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. One other connection that we'd like to make is the connection to the Nobel Prize. Interestingly, there is no Nobel Prize in psychology. And psychology is not the only field for which that is true. There is also no Nobel Prize in the field of mathematics. So we're not alone in being outside of the Nobel sphere directly. That being the case, however, here is a list of lots of different folks over the past 100 years, or a little more than 100 years, who have won the Nobel Prize in other fields, maybe physiology and medicine, maybe other branches of biology, maybe in economics. All these folks have made very, very important contributions, scientific contributions, to modern-day psychology. Pavlov being a very classic case, as you might recall. He was actually studying digestion, and he's very well known to us for classical conditioning. In 1961, von Bekeschi made some important, or was recognized for some important work he had done earlier on auditory perception and how it is that we hear. He did a lot of work in understanding the physiology that underlies our auditory perception. Konrad Lorenz and Nicholas Tinbergen did some important work in ethology, a branch of biology that tries to understand the organism in its environment and tries to understand how the animal is interacting with others in its environment. Some important ethological work that went on there and has very much inspired contemporary psychology, and we'll get to that when we're talking about observational methods in sessions to come. 1978, Simon was recognized for work in what we might now call organizational psychology. He did a lot of work in organizational decision making. Okay? In 1981, Sperry did some work with split brain patients, and Hubel and Wiesel did some important work on single cell recording in the visual cortex of monkeys and of cats, and basically laid the foundation for a great understanding of how our visual perception operates. In 2000, the year 2000, Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize for some work in memory, a phenomena called LTP, or long-term potentiation. An interesting side note here, I happened to be working in Eric Kandel's laboratory in 2000, and I was just down the hall from him on the day that he won and had been notified that he was going to be the recipient of the Nobel Prize. This, by the way, was reflecting work that he had done in the 1970s, way before I got into his lab, but I happened to be in his center at about the time that he was receiving that award. So that was a very exciting moment. In 2002, Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics for some work that he had accomplished in how people make decisions, and how they make decisions when there's economic scarcity, how rational or irrational people might be. Also some implications here for what we might call hedonic psychology. That is, to what extent are people or other animals attracted toward reward and away from some kind of punishment. And in 2004, some other folks from Columbia University, where I was during my Kandel days, Buck and Axel had won the Nobel Prize for some work, again in sensation and perception, but now for the sense of smell, which we call the olfactory system. So here we can see lots of connections to psychology, even though the Nobel Prize is not offered directly to psychologists. Okay, So in order to make these kinds of Nobel-like contributions, and we hope that you will go on to make some important kind of contribution, even if the Nobel Society doesn't recognize psychology in its sphere. Shouldn't feel bad about that. It doesn't recognize math either. But whatever your contribution might be as a researcher, it's important that you now, at this point in your career, develop the skills of thinking like a researcher. And there are two main attributes along those lines. The first is shown here. Science requires an open but skeptical attitude. This is true of all sciences, including psychology. And the idea here is that we want to be open to new ideas. New ideas about what might cause people to be on the autistic spectrum disorder, what might cause depression, what might cause groups to act the way that they do in social psychology. What is the cause of the underlying differences for the consistent individual differences that we see when we're investigating personality. Okay? We want to be open to all kinds of possibilities here, but we're also somewhat skeptical about the claims that are made. We're not cynical. When we're cynical, we are so doubting that we even begin to question the motives of everybody. And when we're questioning the motives of people who are acquiring evidence, we would sometimes dismiss evidence just because we don't trust the people. Well, we're not cynical, we're skeptical. We're willing to believe a new claim that we're open to, but we're going to demand evidence, and that's our second line here. Science demands evidence. As a matter of fact, we're going to make that a mantra. And here to help us with our mantra is a terrific scientist who happens to be an ethologist, as we mentioned earlier. This is Jane Goodall, as some of you might know. She's holding a stuffed animal that takes the form of some kind of great ape, apparently, and you might know that she worked in the wild making naturalistic observations of great apes, and we learned much about her good work. She's here to help us with today's mantra, or one of today's mantras anyway, and the idea is this, that we're all going to say it together. Science demands evidence. Say it with me. Science demands evidence. Okay, so that's today's mantra. What I'd like you to do now is stop the video and answer this question. Why does science demand evidence? I hope that you're not just taking my word for it. I hope that you'll think through your own reasons for why science might demand evidence. So we'll give you a moment to stop the video, and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, so when we're back in class, we'll look at your responses to this question, why does science demand evidence? And I encourage you, again, to take those prompts seriously. When I ask you to stop the video, please do jot something down. I'm taking a lot of time to make these videos for you, such that we can make our classroom time more interactive, and that will deepen your learning and make you a more effective psychologist, and really a more effective critical reasoner. So please take advantage of this. Help yourself learn this material by making each session as interactive as possible. Okay, now not all forms of human endeavor demand evidence. We've said in our mantra that science demands evidence, but art doesn't, and religion does not demand evidence, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. These are other ways of knowing. The scientific approach is a very marvelous way of knowing, but it's not the only marvelous ways of knowing. I'm sure you in your lives, even though you're very young people, I'm sure you've been moved by different kinds of artistic expressions. Maybe a film has moved you, or a poem, or a piece of musical, a musical symphony, or some other musical construct has really moved you. There are lots of ways of knowing. Not all of them demand evidence. Science does. Religion does not typically demand evidence. It's faith-based. Many people find meaning in religion. Others identify as being non-religious, but those of you who do identify as being religious, this is an important aspect of your life that does not demand evidence. Science is a little bit unique in that way in demanding evidence. We're going to draw a connection between science and our legal system to help us understand how it is that scientists go about their business and what it's like to be a scientist. So in our legal system, we could say that there is a demand for evidence, just like there would be in science. Imagine that there's a legal case. You can think of a recent case, perhaps the Trayvon Martin case. It's a fairly recent legal case. Another one going back a few years is the Duke Lacrosse rape case, and we'll talk about that case in just a little while. In our country, whatever the case might be, one is innocent until proven guilty. Okay, that's the default value that we have in the legal system. In the scientific system, we have a default value also when we're investigating scientific hypotheses. And our default value there is something that we call the null hypothesis. Essentially, the null hypothesis might be thought of this way with respect to correlational studies. Let's say that you and I are conducting a study on the correlation between two psychological phenomena. The null hypothesis would state that these two psychological phenomena are not correlated. Okay, that's the null hypothesis. And what happens is the burden is on you as the researcher to provide evidence to overcome that null hypothesis. Okay? The same thing might be true if we're trying to make a claim about a causal relationship. A simple example might be something about a relationship between the independent variable, which we've said previously is typically plotted on our x-axis or abscissa, and our dependent variable, right, which is plotted on the y-axis or the ordinate. We might want to say that the independent variable is causing a change in the dependent variable. Okay? We're trying to make a causal assumption there, or we're trying to demonstrate a causal relationship. The null hypothesis would argue that there is no relationship there, and the burden is on us to make that claim seem persuasive. So in the legal world, the burden of proof is on the prosecutor, and very frequently a defense attorney will conclude the session by saying that the prosecution has failed to make its case. The evidentiary burden is on the prosecutor. Okay, and just to give you one more example of that, I mentioned a while ago the Duke Lacrosse case, sometimes known as the Duke rape case, going back to 2007. It was in this house in North Carolina where an allegation had been made. The claim from a young woman was that she had been raped by members of the Duke University lacrosse team. Okay? And what we found out as the investigation went on was, first, there was public outrage, as you might expect. It's very reasonable to expect outrage when there's been an alleged rape, because rape is such a horrific crime. So lots was made in the press, and of course there's the court of public opinion, and then there's also a legal court. And those two different courts operate by very different kinds of assumptions, and they have very different kinds of evidentiary demands. In the court of public opinion, the young men who had been accused were more or less thought to be guilty right away, except as the legal case went on, which demanded evidence, we learned that the prosecuting district attorney was aware of exculpatory DNA evidence before the indictment, and yet he had not brought that information forward. Likewise, one of the doctors that was involved in this case failed to report exculpatory DNA evidence. Okay? So an important part of science is requiring evidence. That's one of our mantras for today. But as scientists, we have an ethical obligation to bring forth the entire data set. Data that might be consistent with a claim, and data that might be inconsistent with a claim. We have to look at the entire data set, not just a select portion. When we look at a select portion, we wind up with a travesty of justice, which is what had happened initially in the Duke trial. As a matter of fact, there were so many demonstrations outside of this house that a few years later this house actually had been taken down because it couldn't be used for any other purpose. It had become such a lightning rod because of the mismanagement, really, of evidence in this legal case. Okay? So in science, the burden of proof is on you as the researcher. Just like the burden of proof is on the prosecutor, in the legal domain, the burden of proof is on you. The researcher must provide evidence for his or her claim, and what will happen is, instead of going before a jury, as you would in the legal world, you'll go through what we call peer review. In peer review, a bunch of scientists who are specialists in their field will be anonymously selected, and they will read a written version of your report. And they will think about the methods very carefully. They'll think about the evidence that you're bringing forward, and they'll think about the claim that you're making. You're trying to make some kind of a claim, maybe about a correlation, maybe some kind of a claim about causation, and they will ask themselves whether the methods and the evidence really support that claim. If a researcher makes a claim while providing only questionable evidence, these peer reviewers have an obligation to say, please. Okay? So say it with me. We'll make this another mantra for today. Please. That is, we have to bring forth credible evidence, and we have to engage in credible methodology in order to make any kind of a claim, whether it's an association kind of a claim, which is to say a correlational claim, or whether it might be a causal claim. Okay? Here I've grayed out some bullet items that we had on earlier slides. I just wanted to add this third bullet item to what we had seen before the previous slides with Jane Goodall saying please on them. Sometimes there's going to be, in the scientific review process, something akin to the legal plea bargain. Many of you, I think, will know about plea bargains from the legal world. Researchers wanted to make a major claim, but only had sufficient evidence for a more modest claim. In the world of the in the legal world, we might say that somebody has been charged, for example, with murder, and maybe it was first-degree murder, and during the court trial, it might be the case that at some point the defense will say, well, you know what, we're not guilty of first-degree murder, but we are guilty of some lesser crime. And usually the parties are able to come to some kind of conclusion on that, and the case might wrap up a little bit more quickly given a legal plea bargain. The same thing is true to some extent in the scientific world. When there's some back and forth between the different parties on a scientific journal article that's been submitted for publication, it's under peer review, and some people might say something like, well, you know, you do have an interesting question here, and you do have some persuasive evidence, but the evidence really only establishes a correlation between the two variables. And maybe the correlation is itself news, and because the correlation is news, it's worthy of publication, but maybe the methods and the evidence are not so strong as to warrant a causal relationship between the two variables. So the plea bargain might be that initially the researcher had hoped to make a causal claim, but during the peer review process it was reduced to this plea bargained correlational claim. Okay, there are also many differences between science and the legal system, and one of the differences is that we can say that scientists, unlike most lawyers, we get to choose the cases that we want to investigate. We get to choose our research questions. More often in the legal world, a case might be assigned to you. For example, it might be the case that as a lawyer you do so-called pro bono work. And in pro bono work, maybe the defendant has a situation where she or he is unable to afford attorney, so you're assigned as the attorney to that person because they couldn't afford other representation. So you're basically given the case that you're going to be arguing. In the world of science, though, you get to choose, and this offers us, I think, a lot of freedom, and we should rejoice in that opportunity. It's really great to be able to say, hey, I can pick any question that I want. The flip side of that is not every question that can be asked is a question worthy of being asked. Some questions are trivial. Some are not entirely trivial, but they're only modestly interesting. So we have to develop some skill in figuring out what kinds of questions are going to be important scientific questions to ask. Okay? The choice that the researcher makes about their research question or the research topic will be influenced by many factors. Some of these are historical. Okay? And we've alluded to this a little bit earlier in today's session. In the early or mid-20th century, behaviorism was the dominant way of thinking. And most research that was done in that time period, at least in the US, was done with under the auspices of the behaviorists. There was an idea that behavioristic approaches should be used, and actually we learned a lot about behavior by doing that. We also learned that there were some limitations, which I alluded to earlier. During the cognitive revolution, we thought that maybe we can go beyond behavior, still using behavior as an indispensable measuring stick, but maybe now we can draw some inferences about cognition. So if you came on board with your psychological research question in the early 20th century, you might have had one approach. When you come on maybe in the 1960s or even a little bit later, you might have had more of a cognitivistic approach. Contemporarily, something that's very important and getting a lot of research attention would be physiological approaches to psychology. And many of us are familiar with MRIs, or magnetic resonance imaging. There's a variation on that called the fMRI, for functional magnetic resonance imaging. There's also transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and this is the case where we have a device that applies a small magnetic pulse to the brain and momentarily disrupts different kinds of behaviors, maybe different kinds of motor behaviors, or even our perceptions and so forth can be momentarily disrupted by this interruption in our ongoing physiology with this magnetic pulse. Also, many of us will remember EEG, or electroencephalograph. Here we have the small electrodes placed painlessly on the outside of the brain, and these are recording small electrical voltages at different portions of the brain as we're engaging in a task. What's exciting about this is we have millisecond resolution in EEGs. So we have lots of folks contemporarily who are really engaging in all of these levels, but this was not available until relatively recent years. This was available a few decades before that, and so forth. So the question that you ask, you should realize, will depend very much on historical context. And sometimes you and I and those around us are a little bit like the fish that doesn't know that the water is wet. It might not have been really obvious to folks in the 1940s that they were being strongly influenced by behaviorism, because maybe that was more or less the only game in town. Okay? As more options become available, then we get to see, by contrast, what different kinds of approaches might bring or might offer us, and that might shape how we form our research questions. Okay, other factors influencing research are the social and cultural context and the ethical context. So I'm going to read to you some examples, and we can develop these a little bit more fully during our session in class. I'll just read them for you here because I recognize that this is a little bit texty and it might not come through depending on how you're viewing this. So example number 1, some research on stem cells is permitted in certain countries but not in others. Brief word about that. I do remember when George W. Bush had first taken office in his first term, he was approached by the legislature with some new laws about the limits on stem cell research. And he struck something of a balance in that time, allowing stem cell research. Some folks didn't want to have any research on stem cells. He allowed some, but he put some constraints on what those were. Other nations might have outlawed stem cell research entirely. Others might have had no restrictions. So what kind of research you can do sometimes depends on where you are geographically and at what moment of history you happen to be in that geographic location. Here's another example. Research on the Human Genome Project has raised the notion of genetic profiling. Who gets to know what about your genetic makeup? Here's a third example. Rules governing animal research vary widely from country to country. Here in the US, we have somewhat intermediate levels of restrictions and laws that govern animal research. In the UK and in Germany, they have probably stricter laws than we do about animal research. And in Japan, there are probably less stringent laws on animal research than we have here in the US. So the kinds of questions that you can ask are very much dependent on where you are again. Here, for example 4, we have deceiving participants can be questionable. Earlier in psychology's modern history, there were actually no requirements that the research that was done be reviewed ahead of time by an internal review board or an institutional review board that would look at the ethics of the proposed research. Researchers just did what they wanted to do. Now what has to happen is, and this is a good thing, we bring all proposed research through an institutional review board, and we'll say a lot more about that in sessions to come, including issues relating to deception. When is deception okay? Under what circumstances is deception okay? At what point in the research process is the participant going to be informed and debriefed about the deception? These are all very important ethical questions. Okay, what we're going to do now is I'm going to read you some headlines, and I'm going to ask you when we're done reading these headlines to stop the camera and answer this question: in what ways do these headlines differ from each other? And we're going to see how insightful your answers might be. So here's a bunch of headlines. I want you to jot down in a moment how they're different from each other. I'll read them one at a time to you. A man from California is suspected of arson. Second, Chicago police arrested a CEO, that's a chief executive officer, a CEO, for embezzling money. Third, a couple from Newark was arraigned in court on a charge of parental neglect. And fourth, a reclusive woman from New York was convicted of manslaughter in a case involving her dead neighbor. Okay, so 4 different headlines. The question is, in what ways do these following headlines differ from each other? Stop the video and see if you can come up with an insightful answer to that, and we'll talk about it in class. Okay, welcome back. I look forward to having that conversation with you, and we're going to do one more exercise. I'm going to read you some of these items. I'll read them to you one at a time. And now the question is, in what ways do these research findings differ from one another? A moment ago, we had headlines that could have been from a newspaper, or they could have been from an online news blog or news organization. These are now research findings. And the question posed to you is, in what ways do these research findings differ from each other? Okay, here we go. Number 1, a survey of US adults indicated that 96% of married people reported that they were faithful to their spouse last year. Number 2, research has shown that whether a teen begins to smoke is more strongly correlated with peer smoking than with parental smoking. Number 3, Experimental research shows that writing about emotional experiences associated with being in college, compared with superficial writing, causes college students to have better health and academic outcomes. And finally, over many replications of the same false memory experiment, researchers found that about 3/4 of the participants generated false positives. Okay, so here are 4 different research findings, and the question to you is, in what ways do these findings differ? So we'll give you a moment to stop the video, jot down your answer to that, and then we'll see what you have to say about that in class. Okay, welcome back. I look forward to going over those items with you in class, and please make sure that you take advantage of these opportunities when I invite you to stop the video. It helps you to jot down some information that you'd like to share in class, and helps us to have a very interactive classroom. Okay, researchers and juries both seek truth, but their conclusions are ultimately probabilistic. So you might remember from Intro to Psychology that you were introduced to something called the p-value, and this is pervasive across the sciences. The p-value represents a particular probability. It's actually the probability of committing a type 1 error, which is a false positive. A false positive, as an example, would be the situation that occurs when we believe that there is a relationship between 2 variables, when in fact there is no relationship. It might be the case that we believe there's a causal relationship between 2 variables, not just a correlational relationship. We believe there's a causal relationship when in fact there isn't. When we believe that there's an association, correlational or causal, stronger than there really is, we've made a type 1 error. That's the p-value. We understand things only probabilistically. Okay? So certainty is probably beyond the grasp of both jurors and scientists. We have to settle for probability. And probability is pretty good. And I contrast this with some other forms of knowing. For example, folks who have a religious belief will not say that they believe this probably, but they believe it with certainty. And scientists don't go there. We look at the evidence, and we say that we're willing to believe something with a certain probability that is usually in proportion to the strength of the evidence that we have for that particular claim. Okay, a note that I have to offer you is that a colleague of mine tells psychology students to remove the word prove and proof from their vocabulary. Those words are too strong. Typically, in the empirical sciences, which would include such things as psychology, as well as biology and chemistry and astronomy and physics and the geosciences, when we're engaging in an empirical investigation, typically prove and proof are too strong. We use these words only in the case of mathematics, where we're not empirically investigating something, but we're arguing about the logic of a particular proposition. One example that you might remember from high school is the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. You can do a mathematical proof of that, and you put together logical propositions about the properties of triangles. And when you arrange them properly, you do come to the conclusion that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Okay, that's a mathematical proof. That's not what we're doing here. We're investigating things, and we're looking at behaviors, thoughts, and feelings probabilistically. And that's where our p-value comes from. So the word prove and proof, those 2 words are too strong. Okay. Caution is needed when evaluating research findings that are reported in the popular media. What we can say is that although we're always intrigued by media reports of recent scientific investigations, we need to be cautious for 2 reasons. First, not all research is solid. It might be the case that a pair of researchers had engaged in a research investigation, maybe even an experiment, and they reported their work, and maybe their work was not very rigorously reviewed. Maybe it was the case that essentially the jury missed something. Going back to our legal case, you know that we have such things as travesties of justice. That is to say, every once in a while, the jury gets it wrong, for whatever reason. Well, every once in a while, the peer reviewers get something wrong, and something is approved for publication that probably should not have been. So sometimes the science is not so solid, and yet it makes its way out into the media. So this is at least one reason why you and I should be skeptical about things that we hear in the media. Reports about scientific investigations. That's one reason. The other reason is sometimes the good news is that the science really is solid. The reviewers got it right, the scientific investigators got it right, they used their methodology very appropriately, they acquired some very persuasive evidence, and they do have evidence for the claim that they want to make. So the science is solid. But we lose something in translation occasionally when we're moving from the scientific report, which is maybe 10 pages long, maybe 20 or 30 pages long, versus the little news blurb that you get. Sometimes we lose something in translation because of brevity. Something is put out very briefly in a very catchy kind of way, and that catchiness clearly grabs our attention, but it actually loses some of the detail, some of the subtleties that were important in the initial report by the scientists. So that's one of the ways that we lose something in translation. Sometimes just the change from a long report to a short report is enough to make a news report somewhat inaccurate. Other times, scientists use words in a very particular way that are not shared by the general public. And so there's actually a misuse of terminology as we're going from the scientific report out to the general media. So we should be very cautious when we're hearing about scientific reports in any branch of science, but clearly for our purposes here, when we're talking about psychology, the science of behavior, thoughts, and feelings, we want to be very careful. Here's a potential pop quiz question on that topic. How does the above warning relate to the Mozart effect, which you might remember learning about in Intro to Psychology? So I'll ask you to stop the projector one more time, stop the video, and see if you can answer this question, and we'll come back and take your responses in class. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, we have to, at various times, generate hypotheses, and there are different ways of generating hypotheses, generating research questions. Here, we have a small list of possibilities that I'd like to share with you. These come to us from McGuire in 1997. There are many more possibilities, but here are just a few that might help you think about how to generate hypotheses. And we'll spend some time on these in class. For right now, I'll just read these to you in case they're not really clear. One way of generating hypotheses is to consider deviations and exceptions from a general trend. Okay? One possibility is, for those of you who know something about the history of astronomy, the planet Neptune has a very, very interesting discovery and a very interesting story associated with its discovery. So we'll ask you to think about how this line, consider deviations and exceptions from a general trend, how might that relate to the discovery of Neptune? I realize that that is an astronomical phenomenon, not a psychological phenomenon, but it is important for us to make connections across the sciences as a liberal arts student would do. Imagine how you would behave when asked to solve a problem. Consider similar problems whose solution is already known. Make sustained, deliberate observations of a person or a phenomenon. Darwin did this when he went to the Galapagos Island and was noticing some sort of descent with modification. Okay? You might think about an example in psychology of how you might make sustained or deliberate observations of a person or a phenomenon. Here's another possibility. Generate counterexamples to an obvious conclusion about behavior. Okay? And finally, borrow ideas or theories from other disciplines. In my own line of work in sensation and perception, I've borrowed very heavily from the physicists who do something called a Fourier analysis. Only a few of you might know about Fourier analysis. I don't presume that you do know about that, but it gives us a chance to make connections to other sciences. Some of you might be familiar with this terminology from biology, this idea of having genotypes and phenotypes. We can think of that very generally as causes and effects. Okay? So we might think about how we can relate those ideas to this suggestion that we borrow ideas or theories from other disciplines when we're trying to generate our own psychological research. Here's another set of possibilities. Sternberg in 1997 offers these to consider when evaluating research questions. Number one, why is this question scientifically important? Number two, what is the scope of the question? Is it so narrow that it's not important? Clearly Darwin's work was important not just for life at the Galapagos, but life really everywhere on the planet. Very interesting, very powerful theory that he had. We want to have a broad scope, hopefully, for our research questions. What are the likely outcomes if I carry out this project? To what extent will psychological science be advanced by knowing the answer to this question? Why would anyone be interested in the results obtained by asking this question? These are some of the ideas that you might entertain before you embark on your research question. It would be a shame for you to go through all this work of doing the research when in fact maybe you haven't satisfied these questions. We don't want to do this for busy work. We really want to ask some important scientific questions. Okay, in class we're going to do a hands-on exercise on a report that came out in the Psychological Bulletin from the American Psychological Association back in 1999 that was a very controversial study. It used a procedure called meta-analysis, and we're going to have this handout in class. I don't expect you to do anything with this for right now, but you have had the opportunity to stop the video under many circumstances in this presentation, and you've already written down your answer to many of these items. As always, I'd like you to conclude by thinking overall of what we've discussed in this video and what's clear to you, and make a note of one or two things that are particularly clear, and make a note of one or two things that you would like greater clarification on, and hopefully either I can answer that for you in class, or even more desirably, your fellow students can help you with an answer to that. I look forward to seeing you in class.